Opposition victories in elections are extremely uncommon in Latin America throughout the 19th century. Instead, whichever party is currently in power is normally guaranteed to win the next election. Individual leaders do typically comply with term limits during this era, but when they have exhausted their term limits, they hand power over to another man from their own political party. As a general rule, opposition parties just do not win elections in 19th century Latin America. This situation contrasts sharply with electoral politics in the antebellum United States. Although there was a lengthy 28-year period during which only one party held the United States presidency, there were also several peaceful transfers of power through elections during the first 60 years of the Republic. Opposition parties in the United States did generally have a pretty plausible chance of winning most of these early elections, and opposition victories happened on a pretty regular basis during the final decades of the antebellum period. We do not see this sort of alternation in power in Latin America during the 19th century. Instead, in most countries, the same party always wins election after election until it is finally removed from power through the use of military force in the form of a partisan revolution. And then the other party always wins election after election after that. In other countries, there are a few rare instances in which the other party is allowed to come to power through an election, but this normally happens only under fairly exceptional circumstances, such as when the incumbent party is badly divided, or when the opposition candidate actually has the support of a large segment of the incumbent party. Even in these countries, partisan revolutions are still the primary mechanism that opposition parties use to obtain presidential power. One of the supposed strengths of two-party presidential democracy is that it is supposed to offer voters a straightforward yes or no choice about whether they want to keep the set of people who currently wield power. We invest the president with fairly considerable powers, but when their term ends, the voters get an opportunity to sanction or reward the president or their party in the next election. If voters like how the president governed, they vote for his party again, and that party retains office. On the other hand, if enough people are dissatisfied with the performance of the current president, they will switch their votes to the opposition party in the next election, and presidential power changes hands. It is a very imperfect system, but as long as the two competing parties are evenly matched, elections can ensure at least a basic degree of popular accountability in two-party presidential democracies. But in 19th century Latin America, elections were almost never a fair fight between two evenly matched parties. Instead, the current president holds several institutional advantages that enable him to tip the election in his party's favor and prevent the opposition party from winning. One of the president's most important powers is the power to appoint the various officials who make up the national government. And these officials often have a vested interest in ensuring that the current governing party holds on to power in the next election. During this era, civil servants in Latin America almost always vote for the incumbent party because there is a good chance that they will lose their jobs if they don't. In some countries in the region, the president also holds authority over the officials responsible for administering the election. And this opens the door to a variety of abuses such as electoral fraud and the suspension of voting rights for opposition supporters. Finally, the president also controls the coercive apparatus of the state, including the military, the National Guard, and the police. And this enables the governing party to intimidate or repress the opposition. Combined, these institutional advantages make the election result a foregone conclusion. Unless the incumbent government is unusually incompetent or badly divided, it is almost guaranteed to win any election. When the same party always wins election after election, people often assume that this is the result of electoral fraud, such as ballot stuffing or messing with the vote tally. And this type of fraud certainly did happen on occasion in 19th century Latin America. However, electoral fraud is usually a measure of last resort that governing parties turn to only after they have exhausted all of their other options. In these 19th century elections, simple voter intimidation was usually enough to ensure that the governing party won the election. The thing that makes voter intimidation so effective during this era is the fact that the secret ballot just isn't a thing in most countries in the world during the 19th century. Most countries in Latin America still used viva voce elections during this period. In order to vote, you would walk up to the front of the line and you would announce your vote out loud for everybody else in the line to hear. As a result, your neighbors, your boss, your landlord would all know exactly how you voted in the election. Even after countries in Latin America start transitioning to paper ballots, this still isn't usually enough to ensure that vote choice is secret. In many cases, each party would still be responsible for printing their own ballot, and the ballots are really just a long list of names of all of the people that the party has nominated for various positions. In order to vote in these elections, you would often have to pick up the ballot from somebody in the party, like a candidate or a party activist. You would then walk to the polling place with your ballot in hand, and you would place your ballot in the ballot box. The parties themselves want to know how you voted, so they often take care to make their ballots distinctive. It might include some visible partisan symbol on the ballot, or they might print them in different colors just in order to make them easier to identify with just a quick glance. And even if you try to keep your ballot concealed as you walk up to the polling place, there is still a chance that you will be stopped and searched by some official, especially if they suspect that you are trying to vote for the opposition party. In many Latin American countries during this era, the president is responsible for appointing the people who run the elections, so the election workers who staff the polling place are usually loyalists of the current governing party. And if they do not like how you are going to vote, they may try to stop you from casting your ballot in the first place, or they may retaliate against you and your family after the election is over. Under these conditions, you would have to be pretty committed to the opposition party to ever vote against the incumbent. But the coercion of voters does not always have to be violent. Many voters also face employment-based pressure to vote for the incumbent party, and this is especially true of civil servants and government bureaucrats. Some civil servants may have gotten their jobs in the first place by being loyal partisans of the governing party, but even if they didn't, it would still be in their interest to vote for the governing party for two reasons. First, civil servants might be fired from their jobs if they ever vote for the opposition. Second, if the opposition party wins the election, they are probably going to want to fill the civil service with their own people. So if you currently hold a job in the civil service, you are more likely to keep that job if the incumbent party prevails in the election. Now, the number of civil service employees is still pretty small in absolute terms in Latin America during the 19th century. But since the electorate is also extremely small, civil servants can make up a pretty large share of the electorate. In the United States in the year 1900, there was around one federal government employee for every 100 voters. But in Chile, central government employees were closer to 10% of voters, while in Uruguay, government employees accounted for over 40% of the electorate. As a result, in many Latin American countries during this era, the current governing party has a very extensive base of votes that it can rely on, simply by virtue of the fact that many of these voters owe their jobs to the people who are currently in power. So what can the opposition party do about all of this? What strategies can the opposition turn to in order to fight back against this election interference? One of the most common opposition strategies during this period was simple abstention. If we aren't going to be allowed to win this election in any case, why should we bother to participate at all? Why risk the safety and lives of our voters and candidates? And why legitimize these sham elections by participating in them? In other cases, the opposition party might decide to compete in the election even knowing that they are going to lose, and they then plan to protest the election result afterwards. These post-election protests usually are not enough on their own to change the election result, but the threat of post-election violence may be able to deter the president's party from being too blatant about its election interference. In a few instances, these post-election protests might even trigger a larger revolution that leads to the downfall of the incumbent party. Especially by the end of the 19th century, we also start to see opposition parties demanding various institutional reforms that are intended to make it harder for incumbent parties to steal elections. One common reform was the decentralization of elections. Instead of letting the national government control the electoral machinery, we will let each state, province, or municipality control their own elections. Decentralized elections could be just as prone to abuses as centralized elections, but this decentralization does at least help ensure that the advantages of incumbency are no longer monopolized by a single political party. When elections are controlled by governors or mayors rather than by the president, it is easier for opposition parties to gain a foothold in power if they are electorally powerful in particular regions. By the early 20th century, there is also a push to enhance the secrecy of the ballot, usually by adopting what is known as the Australian ballot. Instead of having each party print their own ballots, the ballot is now printed by the government and provided to voters at the polling place itself, and the voter simply marks their vote choice on the ballot itself. This just makes it a tiny bit harder for election officials to verify how somebody is voting. Nowadays, most countries in Latin America have also worked to depoliticize the administration of elections entirely by placing elections under the control of an independent election tribunal that is no longer under the influence of the president or any other elected official. Though this type of reform doesn't usually come about until much later on in the 20th century. In the meantime, one of the best strategies available to opposition parties is party building itself. Although the deck may be stacked in favor of the incumbent, the party might still be able to eke out a victory if it is much better organized than the incumbent party. Opposition parties are the first parties in Latin America to develop strong formal party organizations during the late 19th century. In the short term, this stronger and more permanent style of organization helps the party run a more coordinated and effective electoral campaign. Over the longer term, this type of organization also helps these parties build deeper and more permanent bases of voters who are willing to stick with the opposition party and turn out in elections through multiple defeats despite the grave personal risks that voting for the opposition entails. Even a well-organized opposition party still faces an uphill battle, but as we are going to see later on in this series, opposition victories in elections do become increasingly common by the 20th century, as opposition parties throughout much of Latin America develop stronger party organizations that enable them to fight back against the governing party's election interference.